All right, well, I could probably take some questions on that stuff if there are any. I haven't looked at the chat. I see there's
Yeah,
five
so
or
there
six.
actually wasn't, there weren't many questions submitted during the demo. I'm hoping
Okay.
that everybody is really good at muscle rigging by this point. One
No
question
worries.
from David, and he was, I think Tristan might have helped him out already, but he was asking about rivets.
Yep.
Just what are those?
The rivet script is like, I think probably the oldest Mel script. It's just what it does is you can find it on high-end 3D or something. And I think Maya has its own built-in rivet these days, or point-on-surface constraint, whatever it's called. Basically what rivet does is you have to pick two edges for it to work. And what it does is it extracts the edge as a NURBS curve, or an implicit NURBS curve, and then lofts a surface between the two. And then it uses a point on surface node to get the orientation of that NURBS surface. And then that way you can parent a transform to any part of a mesh. So that's what that rivet is. You have to use it, you have to download the script from the internet. Somewhere like high-end 3D has it for free. So that's
Yeah,
what that is.
was saying that you could get it on Creative Crash.
Yeah, is that the new name for it? Or yeah, I think it's the same thing. Yeah.
James chimed in and says, "Subtissues used for muscle firing?" Question mark.
Yes, you can. So for something like the delts, for instance, as you'll know, the delts are made up of 3 individual muscles. So you could have this object be your parent tissue, and then to get really fine control over firing on the delts, you could have an individual, the acromial delt, the medial, and the posterior, I think, and then have them all as subtissues, and then you can make fibers on the subtissues, and then that way you can get very precise control over how you're firing these things. So I actually did a heart recently, somewhere. Yesterday I did it. So it's not, if you know how a heart works, you'll know that this probably looks wrong, but I just kind of made it yesterday. And so in the heart, there's kind of 4 different chambers, as far as I could tell. And so I used subtissues to do the firing of the heart, just like that. So the heart model itself is the parent tissue. Then you have these 4 chambers, each of which has a fiber, and then I fire them in sequence. So yeah.
Awesome. Michael asks, what about using a hair follicle to attach?
Hair follicle, yep, that would work, I think. Does hair follicles go on poly objects? I don't know. I can't remember. I think, yeah. Yeah, they do, yep.
Let's see, how to use goal attachments on the creatures?
All right. Goal attachment is really similar to a regular attachment, except that it works on vertex ID. So if you have 2 things, if you have a copy of your object doing something, say you have a maybe you have a face, or you have a fully animated character that is done with skin clusters, and you just wanted to attach a Ziva thing to it, you could goal attach between those 2 things. So you could Zivify your skin cluster character, for instance, by just duplicating the mesh and turning it into a Ziva tissue. And then you could goal attach between those 2 objects. You could turn your skin cluster into a bone, and then goal attach between the 2. And it would work because it's working on vertex ID. Even if the poses were different, you could goal attach between the poses and it would work, but that wouldn't work with a regular attachment because it's not based on vertex ID, and it would get the wrong closest point on surface. So that's the thing with those.
I actually had some questions come in.
Mm-hmm.
I'll answer that as well. Does Ziva allow usage of Mel or Python tools?
It's both. We usually wrap the Mel commands in Python, but I'm told on good authority that the Python just works, that you can just import my commands.mc and use Ziva commands like that. As MC, and then do mc.ziva tissue true or whatever, and that should work. But to be absolutely safe, I know that the mm.eval ziva-tissue, whatever, that needs to be in quotes, that will always work. So that's usually how I write stuff for Ziva.
Great. And then, let's see, Tristan asks, can you show us how to set up basically a subtissue?
Sure. Yep. So maybe I can open up, but do I have the hard thing? No. Okay, just trying to think of a good example. I can just do a basic one in like a lab test. So here's my heart model, and I'm going to make a chamber in it. And then I'm going to I'll just make turn this into a tissue. Load the plugin first. And then I'm going to convert my chamber into a tissue as well. And then, so you select the parent tissue first, and then the subtissue, Ziva, and then you come under the Ziva menu, come down to add tissue property, subtissue, and you notice now that the tet mesh of the subtissue went away. So the subtissue always uses the parent tet mesh, if that makes sense. The other thing is that you still preserve all the properties of your subtissue, except that none of the stuff on the Z tissue node, the node's still there, but it's not being used. So it inherits all the properties from the parent tissue in terms of that node. However, it can still have its own materiality. So I could make this much more rigid or more dense or whatever. And I can also add things like fibers. So with the subtissue selected, I can add tissue property muscle fiber, and then I can say key that. And I just make this a bit smaller and turn off gravity. I have no idea how this will look, but you should be able to get the idea. So I add a cache. So you can see that the subtissue contracted, and it affected the rest of the parent tissue. Playback speed.
It says,
Yep. So that's cool. And you can still attach to that as well. So if I think you can anyway. So if I have a bone object over here, oops, you can still grab vertices from the subtissue and attach to, did I make that a bone? Yeah. And then make an attachment. It's going to work, isn't it? Why don't I see it? Oh, because I'm not in start frame. And so if I bring gravity back, so you can see the attachment is on the subtissue vertices, but it affects the parent tissue. Yep, that's kind of the workflow for that.
David also is impressed by this.
Okay, nice.
Oh, JDOS asks, would you use subtissues on your volume sock geometry for the rib cage?
You could. You definitely could. So if you wanted the rib cage, so if you wanted to have the rib cage to be more rigid, for instance, than the area around the guts, you could definitely do that. You could use a subtissue to do that, but you could also use material layering as well for that one. But yeah, the subtissues are great when you want to have even more precise control. So maybe you have like a situation where you have this this sock, as it was called, and you really want to have precise control. Like maybe you still have the rib geometry, and you want to make the ribs subtissues and make them quite rigid. That would totally work. That would be a good use case, actually. Yeah.
Asks, after applying the line of action on a muscle fiber, is there a way to control the amount of bulge caused by the firing? The muscle contracted after she applied the line of action, but the bulge didn't come out the way she wanted it to.
There is, the only way to really control that is to kind of be particular about the endpoint map. So you can do things like put the endpoints sort of on these vertices here, for instance. So it would end up looking like this. So you'd kind of do something like this, and then like that. And you can kind of play around with the shapes that the fiber will make by doing that sort of thing. But it's not going to give you the ability to, say, hit a shape that you've sculpted, for instance. That is a highly requested feature and is being worked on, I believe. So,
yeah. Kleber, he asked a question and James helped answer it in the chat, but it was, if you could use Ziva to behave like car metal bending or a car crash scene. Yeah, in the chat, James said that the car crash example requires what's known as a plastic deformation, and we're working on the functionality at the moment, but the current version of Ziva only uses elastic deformations, meaning tissue will try to return to its original shape, just as you'd mentioned.
Yeah.
And Rano asks, is there a way to use corrective sculpting / modeling on top of a muscle simulation?
So to do that, currently you'd have to do that as a post process. So you do your muscle sim as usual, and then you'd have to use do shot sculpting on top of the alembic bake. But again, that as I touched on earlier is something that we're aware of, and we really want to enable users to do that, to be able to really art direct their shapes, because really, especially in the feature animation world where silhouettes are super important, it'd be really nice to have a way that you can just, get the silhouette of a shoulder, for instance, and get it nice and have it all feed back into the sim. And so we're definitely going to enable artists to do that in the future.
Thomas says this makes him want to scrap his student project and get into CFX with Ziva.
Do it.
Okay, that was great. Thank you so much for all of the questions, everyone. Feel free to ask more of them as we continue on in the webinar. So we have about half an hour left, and I think that's the perfect amount of time to start talking about Ziva VFX version 1.4.